Religious liberty is a topic that is always worth the time to think about and talk about because the concept of religious liberty is a uniquely American contribution to the history of Western civilization, but even more so, the idea of religious liberty is a uniquely Baptist contribution to the history of the American experiment. We know historically that there is a give and take in the relationship between church and state, and we are forever trying to assess, in particular instances, exactly how that relationship should play out. Right now, there are shifts being made by the United States Supreme Court, and so the proper understanding of government and organized religion is once again a topic worth examining. So let's talk about religious liberty. In 1971, there was a Supreme Court case entitled Lemon versus Kurtzman. The decision of the Supreme Court in 1971 was that they established what came to be referred to as the Lemon test, which was supposed to be a series of questions that could be applied, a template or a framework that could be applied to any potential interaction between government and religion. And the goal of the Lemon test was to prohibit what they called excessive entanglement between church and state. Over the subsequent decades, as they tried to prevent excessive entanglement between church and state, succeeding decades saw a number of court cases decided almost entirely in the direction of completely segregating Christian influence from the public square. For example, a court case called Meek versus Pittenger a number of decades ago decided that the state of Pennsylvania could not provide instruction materials or equipment to religious schools. A different case, Wallace versus Jaffrey, decided that Alabama public schools couldn't authorize a moment of silence for, quote, meditation or voluntary prayer. In the McCreary County versus ACLU of Kentucky decision, the Supreme Court would eventually decide that Kentucky could not have a display of the Ten Commandments in Kentucky courthouses. In other words, the Lemon test was designed to simply provide guidelines to prevent what they called excessive entanglement. It was used in such a way to totally segregate public spaces and public dollars from anything religious or what we might call religious adjacent. In other words, rather than stopping excessive entanglement, the Lemon test became a weapon used by the left to prevent religious involvement or interaction at all in the public square. The idea was the separation of church and state is final and absolute, and religion can have nothing to say about the great issues or political questions of any given generation. This is an invention of modern liberalism. It is not faithful to the positions of the Founding Fathers as expressed in their private letters and in the Federalist Papers. By 2022, the Supreme Court explicitly overturned the Lemon test with a decision entitled Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, where they decided that a school district could not fire a football coach for praying on the football field at the end of a football game. But even before that, the court had already begun retreating from the position that tax dollars can't ever be used under any circumstances for purposes that have some aspect of religion attached to them. Instead, the justices took a more compatible position with the original understanding of the First Amendment, which is that the government doesn't have to be afraid of religion. It just can't treat one religion better than any other religion. That's kind of the guiding principle that the Founding Fathers viewed, to not give a particular advantage to a certain institutional form of religion over others, but the government was never meant to be purely neutral or, in reality, purely secular. And the idea that a secular government can be purely neutral is, in fact, a serious misunderstanding of the way human nature works. Proponents of strict separation of church and state have long argued that the government has to be completely separate from religion as a way of maintaining what they call religious neutrality. But it's always been a mistake to confuse secularism with religious neutrality. In fact, communist countries for decades have reminded us that secularism is generally the goal of those who are religiously hostile, not those who attempt to be religiously neutral. In fact, the reality is absolute neutrality is impossible. The government can never occupy a stance that says it is objectively value-free or value-neutral. That's not humanly possible. The government should take the position that we will promote what is good and we will limit or restrict what is bad. Now, the fact that what is good and what is bad is oftentimes understood within the human mind through the prism of religious values should not mean that the church doesn't have a seat at the table. The church doesn't have the opportunity to speak prophetically with moral authority into the great issues of the day. Allow me to describe some beliefs, and you tell me when this begins to sound religious. RuPaul, who is probably the most famous and widely recognized drag queen in America, RuPaul stated not too long ago in an interview with Time magazine this quote, "Drag has always served a purpose. We mock identity. We're shapeshifters. We are God in drag. And that's our role, to remind people of that." Now, when you think through that statement, what it tells us is that RuPaul, voicing transgender ideology, is essentially arguing that the self has become self-creating and the individual has now taken the sovereign mantle of identity making out of the hands of God, where it has always been in not only traditional theology, but in the traditional understanding of human nature present in the history of Western civilization. How many state-funded schools shape impressionable minds with the doctrine that human nature is not defined by God, but by the sovereign individual? In other words, you get to decide who you are in your own version of reality. How many tax dollars fund schools that faithfully instruct young people in the doctrines of Karl Marx and his ideological descendants, like the critical theorist Herbert Marcuse and Derek Bell, the father of critical race theory? How many are forced to learn the orthodox promises of salvation that in order to save ourselves from the sins of capitalism and whiteness, that our children must learn the penance of social justice activism in order to set up a rigid egalitarian heaven on earth? In other words, if religion is totally segregated from the public square will not be value neutral. In fact, the alternative to religious influence is secular influence, and secularism has all of the earmarks of a religious belief system. Should that kind of secular spirituality, that kind of social activist faith, that kind of progressive ideology, should that be placed into the minds of our youngest citizens, all on the taxpayer's dime? What is the proper understanding of the relationship between church and state? Well, let's just keep it in the realm of schools. A teacher in a Christian environment might tell children to respect their fellow students because every person is created in the image of God. A teacher in a secular environment might tell students to respect other people because life will be easier if you learn to get along. Now, one version of those essentially identical lessons, one version is training Christians, while the second version is creating what we might call moral consequentialists. In other words, the idea that you only do certain moral behaviors because the consequence is easier for you to live with. It is a very practical approach that says it's only right if it makes my life easier. There's no objective standard by which behavior can be evaluated. It is a very pragmatic approach to the establishment of moral behavior. Now, the idea is that while both of those are different versions and they produce different results, neither one of those options is actually neutral. Sure, a cross hanging on a wall communicates a religious message. But let me tell you, a rainbow coffee mug that says love is love that sits on a teacher's desk, that is equally suggestive of a particular creed which is being promoted as a legitimate belief system. To suggest that the Ten Commandments is religiously charged, but the pride flag is somehow neutral, doesn't even pass the straight face test. It's ridiculous. Now, as Christians, we don't want the government to require a particular or specific profession of faith, but we shouldn't confuse religious tolerance with religious neutrality. Religious tolerance is the goal. It's possible. Religious neutrality is a fantasy. Our goal should always be that government promotes the good, punishes the evil, and we shouldn't need to apologize for that. That's not only what God created government to do, but frankly, it's the only alternative for a successful society, because the only other choice is to promote the evil and to punish the good. And frankly, no one except the most extreme and bizarre positions in our culture should have any desire for that. Well, this is the government side of the equation. But necessary to understanding this is we have to understand the Christian side of the equation. The temptation for decades now has been, particularly among the elites within American evangelicalism, is that they somehow yearn to be liked and loved by the powerful and the beautiful in our culture. That's why you see so many churches, so many parachurch organizations, so many academic institutions that have Christian roots. You see them caving to the dominant ideologies of our day with the idea that somehow if Christians can just go along to get along, it'll be okay. One of the most recent examples is Fuller Theological Seminary, an independent evangelical school that just released their new school policy regarding their position on marriage and sexuality. Now, what's fascinating about this is that Fuller announced with their new policy that they have been researching and debating this policy for years. For years, they've been trying to figure out the policy of their school, a seminary, a theological training school. They've spent years trying to figure out what they call the Fuller way. Well, let me tell you what they decided. To their credit, the Fuller Board of Trustees issued a vote to reconfirm the original position on marriage that was in their founding documents, and it said this: they confirmed the institution's commitment to its historic theological understanding of marriage and human sexuality, a union between a man and a woman, and sexual intimacy within the context of that union. Great. So far, so good. If they had just stopped there and said, we reaffirm this, then we wouldn't be talking about it. But that's not where they stopped. They went on in their statement, and this is where it all goes off the rails. They went on to say this next: At the same time, meaning at the same time that we affirm our traditional understanding of marriage and sexuality, at the same time we acknowledge that faithful Christians, through prayerful study, spiritual discernment, and lived experience, have come to affirm other covenantal forms of relationship. In other words, we're going to try and hold on to the traditional biblical view of marriage and sexuality, but we understand that other well-meaning Christians have come to other positions, and we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. The problem with the statement is that it is alien to the Christianity of the Bible and to the Christian faith of church history. From the earliest moments of biblical church history, the church has been crystal clear that following Jesus includes following God's design and the Bible's teaching regarding marriage and human sexuality. While the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15 did not require Gentiles to follow the full Mosaic law as applied to the Jewish people of the Old Testament, it did, however, require that all believers abstain from sexual immorality, which in the Greek is a word which includes homosexuality and every form of perversion or deviation from the covenant of marriage. In Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul describes homosexuality as a dishonorable passion that is the result of God's judgment. In 1 Corinthians 6, Paul explicitly names sexual immorality and homosexuality as sins that will keep one outside the kingdom of God. And in 1 Timothy chapter 1, he lists those same sins as those that are, quote, contrary to sound doctrine. Contrary to Fuller's theological statement, faithful Christians have never been willing, despite their prayerful study and their lived experience, faithful Christians have never been willing to contradict the Word of God on the design of God for the creation and the order of marriage and human sexuality. Now, the president of Fuller Seminary issued this response to criticism. He said, "This issue is complex and messy, and it requires pastoral sensitivity." I find that fascinating because what he's suggesting is that somehow the Fuller Board of Trustees is attempting to be more sensitive than Jesus. Jesus faced complex and messy situations in Matthew chapter 19, and yet he didn't waver from a clear declaration about the biblically designed covenant of marriage. Our God is not a God of confusion. He doesn't speak with different voices and different messages to different people. Jesus speaks about two paths in Matthew chapter 7, the narrow way that leads to life and the broad way that leads to destruction. There is no third way that provides some sort of extra biblical alternative on how to approach marriage and human sexuality. Now, there's no question we live in what might be called an anthropological age. That is, the question of what it means to be human is now being decided in town halls, in boardrooms, and in the halls of academia. It is being decided by those who have no historic, unmovable reference point to make the decision. As a result, our institutions are being sifted today, and frankly, many of them, even Christian institutions, are failing the test. But let me tell you this. The government should not be overly restrictive against the church, while at the same time not providing particular preference over one version of faith versus another. But from the church side of this equation, faithful Christians do not need years of consultation, feedback, surveys, and dialogue. We simply understand that on basic issues of human life, God has spoken. Our job is to listen and then to obey His way, not our own. Let us stand for truth regardless of the appearance of neutrality in our culture, understanding that there is no such thing. You are for the God of the Bible, or you are against. Where do you stand? This is Truth Current.